This is Hobby Talks, a podcast series exploring politics and policy-focused conversations with experts, scholars, and those guiding the most complex issues facing our region and state. This podcast is a production from the Hobby School of Public Affairs in partnership with the Center for Student Media at the University of Houston. In this episode, Hobby Talks host Jim Granado discusses the privacy laws in Texas with Tyler Bridegan from the Texas Attorney General's Office.
Welcome to Hobby Talks. I'm your host, Jim Granado, Dean of the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston. In this episode, I'm joined by attorney Tyler Bridegan to discuss online privacy enforcement in Texas. Tyler is the Director of Privacy and Tech Enforcement for the Texas Attorney General's Office, where he oversees the implementation and enforcement of the state's slate of privacy and technology-related laws. He is at the forefront of the state's evolving approach to privacy enforcement, how it is redefining what compliance means across the country. But Tyler, before we start going through these various issues that you're an expert on, tell us about your journey to becoming an attorney.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jim. And I'll give the brief disclaimer. Everything I say today is solely in my personal capacity and is not necessarily the position of the Attorney General or our office. So my journey to becoming an attorney, I grew up in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. I went to the University of Oklahoma for undergrad, where I studied political science and psychology. And then, I think I always had my sights set on going to law school, but ultimately graduated from Georgetown Law in 2017. And I think I was always interested in the privacy and tech space, even back in law school. Georgetown's kind of a unique place to go to law school because you do have such sort of the policy making of everything that's inherent in DC, baked into your education at Georgetown. So you get to hear from, a lot of legislatures, policymakers, practitioners. It's all happening in DC. So that's sort of where I got my start.
We discussed this a little before we started this talk. You chose public service, but you said there's an action, because many of our students are focused on that, and for their, they're focused on nonprofit, they're focused on public service in some way, but you chose that route once you graduated, but you said there's some advantages to that.
Yeah, I started clerking for, post-graduation, I started clerking for a state and then a federal judge. And then I started at the Federal Communications Commission, which is sort of I always describe it as the OG tech agency. The FCC was on the forefront of broadband deployment, broadcasting, every cell phone, that has all been in the FCC's planning for the past several decades. So that is where I like to say I got my technical chops. The FCC is one of those unique places that it's almost split down the middle between attorneys and engineers. And so everything the FCC does is highly technical. The lawyers who are creating rules or regulating conduct, they're hand in glove with the engineers at the FCC. And it's just this very unique agency where a lot of learning happens. I've always subscribed to the belief that, I'll go wherever like the best experience that I can get is at. And, I've in DC in general, sort of the legal culture there, I think it is expected that in some ways to, go back and forth between government and private sector. So I've spent time in both at this point in my career. And, a lot of that is you get unique insights when you're in the government that you just don't get from the private sector. The private sector is oftentimes a bit responsive to what's happening to government, as opposed to government, you're really setting the tone and the pace and getting to, set priorities and make changes from a policy perspective. But in DC, it's pretty normal they call it the revolving door. Private sector, public sector, and throw in some trade groups in there, which are also, they play a huge role in developing policy for the United States. But it's a unique mix that you can get in DC.
Texas has emerged as a national leader in online privacy enforcement, securing historic settlements with Google and Meta to enhance consumer data protections. Can you provide insights into the state laws and the significance of the settlements?
Yeah. I think a lot of people are surprised here that Texas actually probably, I need to go back and count, but has the most privacy-specific laws, I think, of any other state. California is close, but, Texas actually has the original biometric law, which the Texas legislature first passed in 2008. Illinois took effect first and gets a lot more, I would say, publicity because it has a private right of action. So, a private citizen can file a lawsuit anytime pursuant to Illinois' biometric law. Texas can only be enforced by the Attorney General of the state. But Texas's enhanced privacy protections go back, at this point, that's 17 years ago. Since then, the Texas legislature has pretty steadily passed a lot of privacy laws. They've passed a genetic testing privacy law, which was pretty relevant when 23andMe was in the news recently. A data broker law, which only 3 other states, California, Vermont, and Oregon, have passed. I mentioned the biometric law. We have a data breach law. So if a hacker or a company, accidentally leaks your data, or if a hacker obtains your data from a company, Texas has a data breach law that's pretty consistent with all other jurisdictions in the United States. I'm trying to think what else we have. We now have an enhanced children's online privacy law on the books, as well as there's 2 more that are coming on. A comprehensive AI privacy law, a comprehensive AI law, which only Colorado has also passed something similar. And then coming online Jan 1 of 2026 will be the Texas App Store Accountability Act, which, despite its name, puts affirmative obligations on how every app developer that's operating an app in Texas, what they can and can't do with your data. So the Texas legislature has really passed the full gamut of privacy laws, in which, a lot of copycat laws are then filed in the United States Congress, which it's just a great example of, Texas being sort of the model for potential federal laws.
Yeah. But in mentioning some of the other states, I counted all those states as being blue, where Texas is red. So this is one area where it seems like in the legislature itself, is there bipartisan agreement on these various laws? Yeah,
I think that's one of the kind of fascinating aspects of privacy, is that there's a lot of bipartisan support. In the United States Congress, it's been close to passing a few times, going back to 2018, 2020. There was ultimately a disagreement on sort of 2 key aspects, which was federal preemption of existing state privacy laws, as well as whether the federal law should have a private right of action. But by and large, these there's 90+% agreement on that these privacy laws should pass. And I think when you look at now, I believe we're at 20-ish states that have passed and enacted a comprehensive privacy law. That's pretty much split down the middle. You have Nebraska, you have Florida, Virginia, which is purple state, but Texas, Utah's also been a big leader in passing a lot of these privacy laws. So it really is pretty split down the middle as far as which states are going for it. And I think it's because I think the electorate kind of calls for it. Whenever you learn what some of these companies are doing with their data, how much they're collecting, how they never let it go or never get rid of it, it becomes pretty alarming pretty quickly when described in very plain terms.
So Texas does have one of the largest teams dedicated to data privacy and security in the country. What does that all mean for the average Texan?
Yeah, I think, sort of taking a step back and seeing what a lot of sort of what the enforcement landscape has looked like across states. I think California made a big splash when they became the first state to pass a comprehensive privacy law. They dedicated, their legislature included about $10 million to stand up a new privacy agency solely dedicated to enforcing their new privacy law. That's an incredible amount of money. I think as any government state government worker would tell you to enforce a single law. But our legislature included a little bit around $1 million for the state AG to enforce our law, as opposed to creating a new privacy agency. And I think we're seeing a lot of state legislatures do that across the country. Sort of harping back to what we were just talking about, like informing your voters that you're going to enforce privacy rights, I think is it's a winning issue.
Yes.
This is what we're seeing time and time again, which is just kind of fascinating in the grand scheme of things.
So what are the best practices for identifying risks and protecting sensitive data?
It's a tough one. For an individual person, the Texas privacy law and the privacy laws for all the other states that have passed, they all have some sort of the same core requirements on companies. One of those requirements is not only disclosing what their data practices is, but also letting private individuals submit, what we call like request to delete or request to access. And so those companies operating in Texas, like they have to have a mechanism available for you to submit to request that they delete all your data. And so, as I think what data and what sensitive data companies are collecting varies, and how they might be using that data varies. No matter what, though, they have to have that mechanism where you can submit to a request to delete that data.
Describe your role in the state's enforcement strategies and approach. Is there collaboration with the tech industry or other states?
Yeah, so I came on almost 2 years ago now. I followed a former colleague had come to the Texas Attorney General's office and asked if I was interested in standing up a team here. My role was to sort of hit the ground running, and the Texas legislature at that point had passed several privacy laws. Our data broker law had taken effect. Our comprehensive privacy law was coming up. A children's privacy law was about to take effect. And so really the goal was to quickly enforce and get as many companies as possible into compliance with those laws. And then signal more broadly, that Texas is paying attention. For companies that might not have heard from us, they should seek to comply with the law.
Now, is there a common interpretation of terms across states?
With any new laws passing, there's not a lot of precedent.
Right.
So I would say, a lot of attorneys on the ground across states are discussing, are we interpreting these laws similarly? They do all of these laws have very similar aspects. There are some nuances, but by and large, they do overlap with each other. We're trying to get it right, I would say, as regulators, and so that includes collaborating with other states, making sure they're not interpreting something differently, and sort of working from there. And I think every state is going to. Now we're at about 20 states that have passed laws. I would say about 15 or so have actually stood up specific teams to enforce those laws. And those teams are all a bit still getting up to speed across the country, but they will, as they're dipping their toes into enforcing the laws, I think there'll be continued collaboration to make sure no one's being inconsistent.
What are some of the outlier provisions in the Texas law or Texas laws relative to other state privacy laws?
One unique aspect of ours is that it has a 30-day cure period that does not sunset. So a lot of laws, when they were first passed, they had some form of cure period where after being notified by your respective attorney general that you were violating XYZ provision, the company has 30 days to fix that. Some states, like California, Connecticut, theirs sunset after a certain period of time. Texas's is permanent. That said, I think that's more of a complicating factor for it. Taking a step back, it's I'm not opposed to a cure period. I think it's helpful for especially like facial violations where what's required in a privacy policy, where a company can easily fix that. Maybe they thought they were in compliance with that provision, but upon a second read, they're actually not. I think there's a lot of practices prohibited by these comprehensive privacy laws that are very difficult to, if not impossible, to cure in a 30 days. So like unauthorized sale of sensitive data. Once you've sold data to a company pursuant to a complex agreement, how do you claw that back in 30 days and undo how that company proceeded to use that data that they thought they lawfully purchased? So that's sort of one complicating factor of our law and the enforcement of the law. I think our law is really strong when it comes to what counts as consent. So whenever a company is collecting, using, processing sensitive data, they have to very clearly obtain consent from a consumer. And it's a bit of a high bar, but I think it appropriately so. We're seeing companies are obtaining these very sensitive, I think precise geolocation data has been in the news a lot. There's a New York Times reporting last year on how car companies were using this data and collecting it and keeping it in perpetuity and then selling it to whoever was willing to pay for it. But that data was then being used by insurance companies to charge varying insurance rates, and consumers were just not aware of that. And so under the privacy law, that you have to obtain very clear informed consent in order to do anything with that sensitive data. You must disclose to the consumer. And so I think that high bar, is a very powerful aspect that even with a cure period, it will be difficult for companies that aren't seeking to comply with the law to cure.
Right. So Texas is the 30-day rule. That sounds like that's I don't know. I'm not, extreme's not the right word, but it is. That's, as you just said, a high bar. That's interesting that there's that kind of support.
Yeah, and some states, have, I think Virginia is either a 45-day or 60-day. That might be easier to unring a bell when you've done something unlawful with data, but 30 days that's fast.
Do you think that would discourage companies from working in Texas at all, that they have that, or is it that kind of, that issue is, in terms of day-to-day operations, it's just so small in the scheme of things that they're willing to work with that type of strict rule?
Yeah, I mean, it's all predicated on the AG's office finding a violation in the first place. These are, to find a violation of you sticking with the unlawful sale of sensitive data, those sales are pursuant to complex agreements between very sophisticated parties with very sophisticated law firms. It takes a while to ever find that there was something untoward going on. But I don't think, Maryland has been in the news, in the privacy news a lot, because their law bans the sale of children's data outright, so there's no consent mechanism. Doesn't matter if the parent consented to it. And I think that is being flagged as a sort of alarmist, or not alarmist, but a economical killer in some ways, where companies just do not see a way to comply with that law, at least not easily. At the end of the day, getting consent shouldn't be that difficult. I would say in the United States, privacy law is largely notice and consent regime, which is very different than the EU, which they don't care, or they do care about notice and consent, but that's only one aspect of their law. And so with sort of the somewhat watered down privacy regimes in the United States, providing adequate notice and obtaining consent isn't, I don't think companies would argue, is insurmountable. Right. They may be frustrating, but not insurmountable.
Right. It's also possible they actually agree. I think they probably support it because it affects them as well.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. So this leads to just the more general point: as regulators, how do you balance holding major technology companies accountable while encouraging innovation and continued tech investment in the state? So this idea of being over-regulated discourages people from taking a risk and investing in a company in a certain state. So how do you balance that?
Yeah, I mean, our laws, I think privacy advocates would say our law is one of the weaker ones of the 20 states. So we have that sort of shield to hide behind. So California is far worse. And they're doing just fine economically. I would say they've not had a discouragement of innovation as far as I've seen. But, I think, there's a lot of discretion with any regulator in any state. And so, for example, if a company doesn't fully cure within a 30-day the 30-day cure period, we still might not take further action, right? Like they took steps to fix the problem that we flagged, and I think a lot of times for a regulator, like, that's sufficient. And that could vary between states, but I think there's a lot of leeway there as long as you're making good faith efforts to comply with the law.
What educational resources should companies and Texans expect from your office to learn about the state laws, and what does outreach look like for those companies that want to get involved and engage early?
Yeah, I mean, Texas provides a general FAQ website for both citizens and companies, but it compiles all of the privacy laws that we've talked about and sort of directs you to further resources. The Texas Attorney General's office in general doesn't give legal advice to companies, but we've seen sort of as Texas has established itself as one of the states that I would say is willing to dedicate the resources to enforcing privacy laws. A lot of companies that are operating in areas of concern have done a good job of proactively reaching out and making we for example, like, if a company is rolling out a new product, they might say, hey, like, we'd love to discuss, this is the product, this is the data it's going to collect and how it's going to be used. They're not necessarily looking for like a thumbs up or thumbs down because they wouldn't get it. But, I think it's something, we can ask probative questions and, kind of provide an initial reaction to those products and sort of how we view their privacy practices. I always describe it as if you're a company, or the regulator lens is oftentimes it's a combination of consumer surprise and consumer harm. And if there's both, then I think a regulator feels the need to step in oftentimes. But, if you've disclosed the conduct, I think there's a lot less consumer surprise. And then the consumer harm, that can be, I think of the privacy and data usage space, that's changing a lot. And historically, I think a lot of privacy advocates were focused on the advertising industry and how data was being used for targeted advertising. I think we're seeing use cases beyond that. AI, great example of just ingesting tons of data to train those models. I think insurance industry is finding ways to use that data, and I'm sure there will be others that sort of emerge over the coming years. But it's hard to, I think, from the regulators, sort of speculate which harms are going to ultimately manifest.
Well, that leads to this next question. The digital landscape is evolving, so how do you adjust your priorities and initiatives to meet the moment?
Yeah. I think like I said, new harms emerge every day. I think AI we're starting to see some mental health concerns around AI and what that's exacerbating. I don't know that, though, you rewind 6 months ago, that anyone would have necessarily predicted that, or at least not on a large scale. So, I think I always tell people, regulators are consumers as well. And we also consume the news. So like, we're seeing companies' practices in real time because we're interacting with those companies. I think we're also seeing, where we're paying attention to the news at the end of the day as well. And as those harms emerge, figuring out how our toolbox of laws can help prevent that kind of conduct and or encourage companies to cut that conduct off is sort of always the game we're playing on the back end. But it's challenging. I think AI use cases, those are still very unsettled. We had a settlement last, I want to say September of last year, with an AI vendor who was being deployed in inpatient hospital settings. And whenever we settled that case pursuant to Texas's Deceptive Trade Practices Act, not a privacy law, not an AI specific law, because at the end of the day, our read was that this company was misrepresenting our conclusion was that this company was misrepresenting the efficacy of its AI. And so you could use a very old established law that has tons of precedent on that front to get to this new tech. And I thought that was a good for policymakers, sort of a good cautionary note of saying, like, there actually are these safeguards in place, legal safeguards that should keep certain conduct related to AI sort of within the socially acceptable realm. But I think from there, we'll see similar to the privacy space. We'll see like AI specific laws and targeting specific harmful conduct that policymakers don't think the current legal schemes can get to.
In that vein, what's next for your team?
Yeah. Well, we have a couple new laws coming on the books. I mentioned this at the outset. AI specific law, the Texas AI Comprehensive Law is coming into effect, as well as the Texas App Store Accountability Act. So, I think in general, we try to show that we are enforcing these laws, in part to be responsive to the legislature, and in part because these laws are addressing conduct that I think are trying to shift how industry is operating in some ways. So I think always expect an AG's office to try to signal that they're enforcing new laws as they come on the books. That's same for every other state. I think we're seeing like Minnesota, their privacy law just came into effect. I expect pretty significant enforcement out of them really quickly. But I think every state tries to signal that they are in fact enforcing their laws as they come into effect.
So the Hobby School integrates theory and practice to try and achieve good government, where one mantra is be under budget and ahead of schedule. But this is also a form of good government, what you're talking about. And could you talk about how you relate what you're doing to good government practice?
Yeah, I mean, I came in and I was lucky enough to have, sort of a good planning period when I knew I'd be coming to the Texas AG's office from private practice. At that point, the Texas legislature had passed, several new laws that I think there was sort of a lack of expertise on how to enforce them. And it's not surprising, right? Like these are new laws, and there aren't that many attorneys in the United States that have expertise in these areas. So I did I laid a lot of groundwork. I think one of our first focuses was the data broker law, which a data broker law is essentially a company who is just dealing in data. They're buying and selling data sets for companies to use. However, they've been in the news a lot in New Jersey because they led to the shooting of a federal judge's son in New Jersey, which I believe is called Daniel's Law. And so, data brokers were sort of our data broker law isn't super stringent. It's just a registration requirement. So we can keep track of who is dealing in these huge amounts of Texans' data. But those are, that was sort of our first big move. And then we sort of went from there. Around that time was when car manufacturers' data collection practices were in the news. And so we quickly tried to be responsive to that. And then, I think on the good governance side, you need, before the government can make a move, you generally need to do a lot of groundwork to build an investigation, figure out what is really happening. We AG's offices around the country have pre-suit subpoena power. And so, we're often talking to companies, behind the scenes, not just companies, but like groups that have interacted with them or their counterparties on agreements, and figuring out like what is truly happening here, and sort of, do we want to insert ourselves into this conduct? And so that has really been sort of the groundwork for each time the Texas legislature enacts a new law, making sure there's processes in place to where we can like efficiently and effectively enforce these laws has been a big focus.
So what advice do you have for our students who want to learn about online privacy enforcement and make a difference in government?
Yeah, it's changing every day, I will say. So I think there's no wrong place to get good experience. There's really great nonprofits in the U.S. on the privacy front. International Association of Privacy Professionals, they have a resource for truly everything. And they're operating, they host like the biggest national and international privacy conferences every year. They're just a great resource, whether you want to see like which states have passed privacy laws, what rights you can exercise in your own state, what's going on internationally in privacy, what's happening in enforcement. Like they cover the gamut. They have great internships. I think they do a lot remote, I will say. If I was in undergrad or even law school, that would probably be one of the first places I would seek to intern. Future Privacy Forum is another great organization. They're I think primarily based in DC, but they've been on the forefront of getting state legislation passed across the U.S. For quite a while now, and I know they're involved in the federal side of things as well. The U.S. Chamber, I think, is another great organization where you could get a lot of policymaking insight. But yeah, those are probably the big three. As far as sort of like practical on the ground experience, and I'm trying to relate this to non-lawyers, so I apologize. But a lot of law schools actually do now have like tech centers. So like I think University of Houston Law Center does as well. But they're not necessarily like just for lawyers. They're doing these law schools are doing a lot of policy work that I think they open their doors to not just law students, but there's a ton of policy work happening on all facets of privacy law that you can get a lot of good experience in. Law firms, I think, are, I think over the past few years, and probably the past decade about now, they've substantially expanded their privacy practice groups, just being responsive to clients. And then the Federal Trade Commission on the federal side, they've been at sort of the forefront of privacy and cyber enforcement. Not as much the policymaking aspect, but it's also a great place to spend some time if you're wanting to get a lot of exposure.
So, since you've taken on this job, has anything come as a surprise to you since you started?
Oh man,
I don't want to get you in trouble.
I mean, I think. I came from private practice and helping companies comply. I think I've been a bit shocked at how much data is really being collected every waking moment of a person's life by so many different companies, and it's being duplicated, sent to other companies, and like it's all just happening in real time. And like sort of going back to our Texas cure period, right? Like unringing that bell is really hard. And it's difficult for consumers to, I think, take control of their privacy in a lot of ways. But there's one company I requested a copy of all of my data, and I was just legitimately shocked at how many. It's a company that, like, I don't know, I don't interact with that much, but how many data points that they have on me from every day of my life. You're when it's listed out in an Excel sheet and it's like thousands of different, and that's just like the different type pieces it's pulling, the data elements, not like the aggregate what they've collected about you. Just seeing like the individual elements that they're collecting at all times it's a bit jarring. So I encourage consumers and just anyone to pick their favorite company and see how many submit a request to know. Wow. or request to access their data, and that should be available in the company's privacy policy. And you can see just how many data elements are being collected, how granular it can get. There's one company that they install software and other apps on your phone, but they are able to use that software to, like, they can detect every time you pick up your phone, and like every time it's just so granular that they're getting like that precise of location data every time you move your phone. I mean, just
taking my hand.
They just reported that. Yep. For those listeners, he waved his phone. I'm
in trouble now.
And I think going back to like data use cases, we'll see what harms can come of that. And that'll come down to like how companies want to use that data, right? That is what's really going to emerge, I think, over the next decade, is just what are those harmful use cases of having that precise of data. And would you want a hacker knowing like or some state actor knowing every place you went? I don't think I'd want most people in my life knowing every place I went.
I only go to 4 places. It'll be pretty boring.
But it's once you see an illustration of how much data is being collected about you, I think it does sort of make you rethink sort of your interaction with companies.
Yeah. So, final question. So this relates to the surprise. I mean, you just mentioned that we just said he's jarring to me, especially we did the motion on the phone. What do you see as being the biggest problem that's coming our way as private citizens?
I think those emerging use cases, it's very hard for, and this is sort of the federal debate around the privacy law, whether or not to have a private right of action. Uncovering this conduct is challenging. Figuring out not only that company is collecting how you just moved your phone, but then figuring out how they're using it and figuring out that they're even in your phone, right? You wouldn't know one of these companies as their software in your phone. It's not like they're not part of the app. They're a software provider to the app, but they are able to collect a copy of the data as well. And so, I think those emerging use cases will be really problematic. I think one thing, I think how AI was trained how AI is being trained, I think raise privacy concerns to the extent that like identifiable data was being used to train AI. And if your AI was spitting out details about where you went with your phone that day, like that would be, I think, problematic. But
right.
We'll see how sort of what harmful use cases emerge. I think we talked about this before coming on the air, but I think hacking threats are at an all-time high right now, and those aren't subsiding. They are truly at their peak. Part of that is like better detection mechanisms that companies are deploying, but your data is at risk of getting out there. And, I think alarmingly how a threat actor wants to use your data, I think that will create a lot of new harms over the years. So we're going to see.
Right. Well, Tyler Bridegan, thank you for the insightful conversation, for being our guest on Hobby Talks. To our listeners, visit our website and social media platforms for information on upcoming program. And again, Tyler, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. This podcast represents the views of the guests and not of the University of Houston. The Center for Student Media provided sound and engineering support, and Soundcast Music provided the podcast song. The series is produced by the Communications and Marketing team at the Hobby School of Public Affairs. For more information on Hobby Talks, including past and upcoming episodes, visit uh.edu/hobby/hobbytalks.